Okay, welcome everyone to this last session of the conference entitled Beyond New Social Movements, ? Before I begin, I need to give you a brief announcement or a request, whether you can all, after the session, make sure that you bring your coffee cups or dump your coffee cups in, or any other trash for that matter, in the bin that's behind this screen. I was asked to ask that, so that's covered now. Right, so in this session, I guess we will move beyond 1968 and discuss what happened after and discuss the question of new social movements, more specifically whether new social movement, how useful the concept of social movement still is or has ever been even. So the three people who will lead this discussion, we're very, very glad to have them here. I think they don't need much introduction, at least not here, and listing their contributions to our field would also take too long. So suffice to say that we are very pleased to have Mario Diani from University of Trento, Hans-Peter Krisi from the European University Institute, and Michel Micheletti from Stockholm University, and they will be speaking in that order for 30 minutes each, and then we will have a plenary discussion for which we will have plenty of time, about an hour, if everyone sticks to their 30 minutes, which I will make sure of with this Swiss invention, which keeps time. So Mario, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. It's a great pleasure, and thanks for sticking until the very end. Now, my talk is actually as much about 68, the relation to 68 of later instances of collective action, and basically what I'm not going to propose any strong interpretation of the facts. I'm going to suggest some analytical lines to explore the issue of the link between different waves of contention and collective action. And in particular, I'll try to propose a way to deal with the issue of the newness of movements in relation to, in the light of their position to the cleavages which are dominant in a political system when a new wave of collective action develops. I will speak about Italy in empirical terms without any claim to generalization, and not even without any claim, frankly, to the robustness of the findings of the data. I will show some data, but it will really be as an illustration of some theoretical point. First is I think some language clarification is in order. For when I refer to social movements, I do not refer to them as an aggregate of individuals or actors or organizations with certain characteristics, but a particular set of patterned relations and interdependence. Let me explain what I mean. Movements are not entities in themselves. I think the best way to think about movements is about a particular way of coordinating. I used the concept in my recent book, well, not so recent, 3 years ago, The Cement of Civil Society. I used the concept of modes of coordination to suggest that different multiple actors can exchange resources in different ways, following different relational patterns, and such exchanges can also imply, or do not, or in very different levels, in very different forms, mechanisms of boundary definition, namely definition of the actor, definition of what is expected of a certain actor, definition of the characteristic of such actor. The idea of, as I said, the concept I use is the idea of mode of coordination, basically is considered as a response that actors that operate in a larger field of are actors mostly interested in certain issues, certain causes, offer the response that these actors offer to some very elementary dilemmas, as I said. One is the issue of the allocation of resources. Decisions are made regularly taken by individuals about how to allocate their time, to where to participate in, which organizations to join. Decisions are taken also by organizations, groups, where direct their action, whether establishing alliances, whether working on their own. There is an whole range of negotiations and discussions which goes on around these themes, around these problems. At the same time, collective action is also, as it implies, more or less explicitly, sometimes in a less obvious way, decision about arguments about claims about loyalties and boundaries. Where are the loyalties? Who is the actor we are mobilizing, trying to mobilize? Who are the opponents? Or what are the criteria to define who is part of the same collectivity, who is not? And there is an immense amount of work taking place at that level as well. And the final point in this regard to keep in mind is these actions, these interactions, they can primarily focus on individual organizations, individual groups, or can involve multiple actors in the field. Why is it important to recognize that? Because basically, very often when we think of change, and so we think of new in terms of the properties of the events, of the individual actors, the people, organizations, or what we think in terms of whether they are doing is new, whether what they are doing is some kind of innovative, whether in terms of repertoires or other or issues. But really, I don't think it makes sense to speak of movement dynamics in that context if we don't ask what are the links between these actors. Having a huge number of individuals interested in environment doesn't make, or having groups working on disparate set of environmental problems doesn't make an environmental movement if actors are not capable of building some connection between them. Actually, for women's issues, you may have women's organizations, but do they work together? Do they share some common understanding, or do they simply address different themes, different problems from very different angles without establishing some connection? So, basically, a movement is not a thing, it's a process, but the emergence of a movement usually corresponds, really, revitalizes sometimes old ties, existing ties, sometimes create new ties, and these ties are, at the same time, instrumental, cognitive, emotional, in the sense that they imply, as Jim Jasper was suggesting yesterday, he was linking emotion also to trust, ties that imply a mutual knowledge and mutual confidence. So the first point is, when we think of movements, and even new social movements in relation to all cleavage, we need to think of these complex patterns of ties. In case you are more interested with that, and in case you have a lot of money, you can buy the book. Nice cover, I have to say. I like it very much. And in case you are interested and you don't have a lot of money, the Russians once again come to our rescue and are lifting the sanctions on Russia. The new Italian government plans to lift the sanctions on Russia, and also possibly in gratitude of the fact that my book is available on the Russian website for free. So if you don't find the Russian website, send me an email and we'll sort it out. So much for what is new, for the movement. Now, what is a new movement? I would suggest, it's not, I have suggested a long time ago, actually, that a movement is new to the extent that it cuts across existing cleavages. Namely, new issues come up all the time. New issues can come up and be incorporated directly within the agenda of existing organizations. The fact that the environment comes up as an issue doesn't imply by any means the rise of a movement. It can be incorporated by existing political actors. It can enrich the agenda. And as a matter of fact, this happens many times, both on the right and the left. So I suggested in 2000, I wrote an article where I suggested that the newness, it was about the new social movement, but it really applies more generally. The newness should be addressed to the extent to which a new set of collective actors develop solidarities and interactions that cut across existing cleavages. Now, as the gentleman to my right has stressed many times, and before you are not the first one, Steinrock and Bartolini and Meyer, and there is a long distinguished list of people who have argued really that cleavages are not distributions of ideological positions, of opinions only. They imply that, but cleavages are embedded in social and patterns of social relations, in associational patterns, in mechanisms, in community ties that reinforce, reproduce, or fail to reproduce sometimes, these ideas. This is a very important point which is often overlooked, especially by analysis that focus exclusively on survey data at the individual level without forgetting about the rest. Now, if we think how does that, do we link the network imagery to this idea to cleavages? And in that article, I suggested that we might think, or I brought in Zimmel, and I suggested that we might think of cleavages in analogy to Georg Zimmel's idea of concentric circles. He used it to characterize pre-modern society, but to some extent the medieval guilds, etc. The idea is there is a concentric circle is such that there is one major form of membership, say you're a member of a guild or a member of a local community, and most of your social ties revolve around it. Now, Juan Linz, back in the 60s, once wrote a paper about in which exactly used that imagery to characterize cleavages, but I wouldn't say it has been used very often. But if you think in some stereotypical ways, some of the most best examples of cleavages, the pillars in Netherlands or Belgium, or the political subcultures in Italy, you can think of that. You can see how that model sort of fits, of course, to a partial extent. It's not just stereotypical to argue that in the golden ages of the cleavages, I mean, being a member of the Communist Party also implied mostly, in many cases, be a member of a cultural association linked to it, of a union linked to it, and so on and so forth. And ditto, if you are actively close to the church. Of course, there were many exceptions. Of course, it was a myth like all myths to beyond a certain extent, but it was still also an idea which might capture some dynamic. So basically, following this logic, instead, new movements seem to follow more what Zimmer characterized as the cross-cutting cleavages, the idea that, and he characterized modernity as such, as the expression of greater individual autonomy. But we can, again, we don't have to fly so high, but we can still suggest the idea, and we find examples of that in the rhetoric. Feminists have often argued to be cutting across traditional cleavage class lines, for example. Environmentalists have done that again and again. Most recently, my fellow national Beppe Grillo and his enthusiastic followers have repeatedly argued that they were cutting across, and as you shall see at the end, they might actually be the ones who have a point. Anyway, important thing is that the development of issues doesn't necessarily get along with the crossing of cleavages. Very often cleavages are articulated within existing boundaries. Now to 68, what was the situation? Oh, sorry. More self-promotion. This is the article. This is definitely cheaper than the other one. It is a European Journal of Social Theory 2000. Again, that's easily accessible, I think, even on my webpage, Academia Edu. Now, how does this imagery apply, let's say, to the kind of 68? I think 68, in many ways, I suggest, I propose, it's not a strong opinion, I propose that 68 might be regarded as both something really cutting, let's say, undermining the standard left-right, and which also meant in Italy religious secular cleavage, but at the same time also reinforcing it. It undermined it because, for example, in the years building up to 68, to some extent 68 brought about the overcoming of traditional associations representing roles in representing interesting in number of fields, for example, students or unions. Before 1968, and for example, the patterns followed this one. I don't have the time, but anyway, there was a situation whereby, for example, there were different unions. Imagine these are unions. They had their members. They promoted their own events. They competed and of course sometimes they worked together. I'm not saying, but they were primarily competing against each other. For example, in the elections for the local delegates at the factory level, they were largely in competition. So they were sort of taking side. It's not. I mean, again, they were closer to a model in which they were primarily competing with very little level of mutual identification and solidarity. Students associations in the university were a bit like that, linked to existing parties, and 1968 blew this type of, it didn't necessarily blow away the organization, but certainly blew away the style. The idea that organizational life was heavily structured by the existing cleavage. It was not only limited to unions or students. In the Christian Catholic world, really there were explicit signs of explicit attempts to break the identification of the Christians with the Christian Democratic Party. Of course, there were many communists who were religious, but I mean, it was more under the carpet, so to speak. There was this opening up. Organizations like Cristiani per il Socialismo, Christians for Socialism, certainly played a major role in that regard. Another element, so, okay, we started moving towards, for example, coalitions, but it was not just coalition. What developed was a more complex dynamic. Like in all moments of effervescence, opportunities for participation emerged that gave more space also to individuals. Individuals were entitled to, for example, in university leaders were capable of mobilizing a mass without making primary reference to any specific partisan factional allegation or political side for a while, for a certain period. There are reports, sound reports, that in the very early phases of student contestation, for example, right-wing students were massively present, for example, in the famous or infamous, depending on the point of view, Valle Giulia clashes in 1967 at the Faculty of Architecture in Rome. What developed was really what it seems to me was what I call in the book more kind of a communitarian subcultural mode of coordination. Individuals making bridges, individuals sometimes even promoting events directly, organization possibly still playing some role, but alongside great spaces of participation for actors, individual actors that didn't want to necessarily to go through the mediation of existing organizations. It didn't last, however. Gradually, new organization developed, certainly both on the new left and on the right. They started developing organizational linkages among themselves and with a variable level of intensity to other parties, to existing unions. Also existing political organizations adapted themselves. For example, Sid Taro in his book on contention, famous book on protest in Italy, he talks about, shows how the Unione Donne Italiane, Union of Italian Women, the women's association linked to the Communist Party, actually heavily transformed itself, turned more into more loose, less bureaucratic, kind of more social movement kind of organization. But so these are, in many ways, the fact that the growing influence, the growing conversation seems to me largely remained within the boundaries of the traditional cleavage. What we saw was more a reinforcing of the left-right cleavage rather than something massively cutting across it. The 1970s, I would dare to suggest, they left a legacy of increased cooperation and also overlapping membership to some extent between new groups and traditional political organizations, but less so in terms of cross-cutting collaboration. This also reflects in the fact that in the 70s, for example, the anti-nuclear movement didn't really manage to make a breakthrough as a unified force. It was split across the traditional conservation versus political ecology lines. With the crisis of the movements, many activists entered Communist Party and Socialist Party. Those, of course, a few went into armed struggle. But then I would have to suggest that the cleavages were pretty much structured and stable. The emergence of the consolidation of the new social movements brought about great hopes for realignment. This was announced in many quarters. But I think it's fair to say that also if you think of works like Russ Dalton and others, I mean, the evidence is at best mixed. There was certainly a sort of a realignment, retransformation sometimes of the left-right cleavage. It's difficult to... It's not I wouldn't say that the evidence is conclusive that the new social movement really cut across. Of course, it would be unrealistic to think that to expect a 90 degrees type of cross-cutting. But I think it's fair to say that the evidence, as far as I can see, is not conclusive. And if we look from data, more anecdotal, from the organizational point of view, I think they're also going that direction. Let me show you some. This is the environmental field of organizations that I study in Milan. The green ones are the most conservation ones. The red ones are political ecology groups. Even visually, you can see there is a tendency to cluster among organizations of a similar kind. If you look at core periphery, you take analysis and you look only at if you look at the stronger ties, multiple ties, these are only ties with alliances and shared members are together. So strongest ties, the picture becomes even more pronounced. If you take out the core organization, okay, this is the core or multiple ties, and you see at the core level, the big political ecology organization at the time, the Green Party, the Environmental League, were actually working with WWF, Italia Nostra, the other major groups. So there was a certain level of integration. But if you move from that to the rest of the field, you can see a pattern which is really, at the same time, disconnected, but the persisting ties are all between. There are two elements to notice here. The existing patterns are all between organizations at the grassroots with a similar profile, and those organizations, conservation, could, broadly speaking, be associated with the left-right cleavage. I mean, it's a bit of a stretching, but it can be associated with that. Whereas there was very little, if you look at the other picture, really, if you were more relaxed in terms of the strength of ties, you would get more connections, but the overall profile doesn't change. So what does it mean? It means a couple of things. Is worth, if I can find that. Well, I'm lost. Okay, now. Yes. Okay, first, cooperations, interactions are still concentrated within within broadly speaking, within the cleavage. So there is only a partial cross-cutting of the cleavage. Not irrelevant, mind me, but far from perfect. And also, in particular, if you look at this picture, there are also many organizations that were only thinly connected to. They had softer ties to some of the core groups, but they were not really strongly into a specific dense cluster of alliances there, which suggests they might be open to other types of alliances later on, which is where I will get to. Let's fast forward to the 1990s and the early 2000s. These are the years in which new social movements continue, but also global justice activism starts to develop in the end of the 1990s. And this suggests really what we see there is also, I think, is a gradual weakening of the connections between even these new citizens organizations and whereas the movement organizations from the 70s have been massively recruited into the parties and the communist socialist parties and the unions, the evidence suggests that this is not so much the case for later waves of protest. That these are kind of, these are data from the 2003 anti-war demonstrations. These are people who marched in Italy. And I broke them down in 4 generations. People that, because of biography, were active either in the post-war, namely there were 16 at least 16 in 1963, so pretty relatively old. People who came of political age around 1968. From new social movements are people who came of political age between 75 and 95, and global justice movements are the latest wave. Okay, for whatever that, the data, as I said, are not conclusive. It was just one demonstration. It was a very big one. But what you can see pretty clear is the huge, these are data about the membership in the unions. The 1968 brings about, among those guys, a greater interest in the union. People who had been socialized there were much more inclined to join the unions, and then there is a very sharp decline over the years. Move to the parties, political parties, slightly different. Political parties very strong already in the post-war period, understandably so. They already start crumbling in 68, and they remain stable on lower level. The difference is not that big, but the gain is there. So what's the story about that? The story about this type of evidence suggests clearly that the link with these are people who participated in activity, were members of all sorts of associations, were members of multiple associations. But their involvement in unions and parties was pretty low. Now, let's take a different angle from using the same data, and let's look at the content. So let's think of individual activists through their multiple, as bridges between different sectors of civil society through their multiple memberships. People acting in more, this again is a Simmelian argument. You connect the different social groups by being present in both of them, all of them. So what you see here is the links between different types of associations. Again, very rough data, but the links between different types of associations based on the involvement of people, and these are the strongest connections. We can go back to the details in the Q&A section. Now, in that regard, you can see there was a strong link between unions and parties, but also to charities. And there were different, this is the way the 1968 generation, let's be clear, these people who were belonging in the 1968 generation contributed to the integration of Italian civil society in 2003. This is what these data are about. Okay, and you can see this type of, so parties, unions were still playing a role in a diversified structure. But if you look only at the ties created by people socialized in the new social movement period, and the global justice movement is very much the same, you see that the position of parties and unions gets detached. Namely, they still have ties, but they are not linked strongly to any other sectors of society. What you see are a set of activities around peace, third world development, human rights, so a kind of global justice type of cluster, and a cluster based more leisure. Modern sports should be leisure time. Leisure and sport activities and educational and cultural groups. So that seems to be the core of the network of civil society based on the multiple membership of the new social movement generation. So this is another sign. Again, it's a weak evidence, it's a limited evidence. It's another sign of the fact that with time, over the 1990s and from the 1980s to the 90s, early 2000s, the link between parties and unions, the traditional interest and representation organizations, and the rest of civil society, which include the activist sector, though not all those are activist, but pretty much so, given the source of the data, was weakening. And this leads me to so what's beyond the specific story, this leads me to, I would say, to some conclusion which also opens up to and speaks up to the future. If we think of activities, if we think of interest in issues, if we think of the number of people who participate in demonstrations or the number of people who claim to have contributed to some environmental groups, we don't have clear signs of a decline, we have contrasting signs, at best. If we think, however, in terms of relation, okay, I accept that this is scattered evidence, anecdotal. I will be delighted to do something more systematic when I retire. I will have time to do that. But in the meanwhile, I think there is enough evidence to suggest that if we think relationally, we at least must recognize that the changing in patterns do not necessarily go along with the change in the characteristic of the actors. There seems to have taken place a transformation in the ways links between different types, sectors of civil society developed, thanks to the role of people socialized to different generations, for example. And my conclusion is, I think this process paves the way actually for the current situation in Italy, in which the mobilizing capacity of progressive organizations beyond specific issues seems to, I wouldn't want to say to have collapsed, but certainly seems to be in serious problems. I would offer as an hypothesis the fact in particular that this weakening of ties came to a turning point, I would suggest, after the 2011 referendum. The 2011 referendum was a number of referenda, including against 4 laws passed by the Berlusconi government, in which there was a huge mass mobilization by action committee, neighborhood associations, voluntary associations of any sort, which resulted in the absolute majority of the Italian electorate voting against Berlusconi's proposals, creating the precondition alongside with the International Monetary Fund for the demise of the Berlusconi government in September 2011 and the failure of the existing parties of the so-called left to link to those sectors. And I think contributed, I want to say it explains, but I think it contributed to the weakening, to the further, eventually to the growth of influence, for example, the 5-star movement over the same sector of civil society. There is a huge evidence that 5-star movement is a very complex phenomenon, but there is a huge evidence that many local chapters of that came out from local action committees that were left in a sort of found themselves in a sort of a vacuum. So, basically, the collapse of, the crisis matters. I suspect the roots of the process were very well beyond the crisis, before the crisis. It was the current difficulties of the link between parties and citizens' associations in Italy came well before that. And now I'm very happy to leave to Hans Peter for the rest of the story. Thank you.
for giving me the cues. You will see, I will say what Mario told you is a very much Italian story, or it's a Southern European story. Now, I will paint with a very broad brush. So take this into account. I try to pack a much more detailed story into 30 minutes. Those who know what I have to say will recognize most of what I have to say, but I will package it based on the title of this panel, Beyond New Social Movements. So, 3 points to begin with. The basic assumption is political parties are the crucial political actors in European liberal democracies. And the story I will tell is about the restructuring of the party systems. I will make an analytical distinction between long-term structural trends and crises. And the new social movements, I mean those of the 60s, early 70s, are part of the long-term trends. And then the crises are mainly, I don't look at the refugees crisis so much, but at the impact of the Great Recession on the European party system. Now, long-term change versus crises as drivers of political change. Long-term factors, Mario also gave me the cue with the cleavage structures. It's cleavage structures, its historical legacies, and its European integration in Europe. Crises is the economic crisis and political crises linked to the economic crisis. Cleavage structures. Mario already talked about Lipset Rocken, the godfathers of everything I have to say. They distinguish between 4 types of cleavages, as you know: economic, class cleavage, left and right, rural-urban cleavage, representation of the farmers, cultural cleavages, religion and region, the center-periphery cleavage. Now, religion and class were the most important structuring factors in European politics. And the traditional configuration of Western European political conflict structures in the party systems were bipolar. In Southern Europe and in Anglo-Saxon Europe, you had a secular left versus a religious right. It was tripolar in continental Europe, left versus liberals, who were the secular people, versus conservatives, who were the Catholics, and quadripolar in Scandinavia. The Scandinavian right was divided into liberals, conservatives, and farmers. Now, famously in the mid-60s, Lipset and Rocken wrote about the freezing of European party systems because this conflict structure they identified had been frozen into place at the end of the First World War, and they still encountered it at the end of the 60s. And then it happened. 2 waves of political mobilization since the end of the 60s or early 70s. The first, 70s and 80s, the new social movements. The kind of conflicts they articulated were arising from the expansion of tertiary education, deindustrialization, the service society, feminization of the workforce, occupational upgrading, which all led to value change, the silent revolution of Engelhardt. They were based on the new middle class. They were not working class movements. That is, more precisely, they were based on a section of the new middle class, the social cultural professionals. And their focus was on cultural issues. So, on cultural liberalism, on rights, women's rights, gay rights, and so forth, individual choice, abortion, peace, ecology, solidarity with the third world, universalistic values in general, post-materialism, as the other guy said, or self-expression values, as his successor is saying. They were driven by these conflicts, were articulated and driven by the new social movements movements of affluence, not movements of crisis. And they were giving rise to new politics, to the Greens, to the transformation of social democratic parties. They have become, in most of Europe, middle-class parties, to democratic socialism, a radical left, red-green kind of phenomena, or, as you could say, the new left. There was a second wave, and it started in the 1980s, the Front National, 1981, until the 2000s, the radical populist right. Now, the conflicts articulated by these kind of characters were conflicts arising from globalization, from opening up of national borders in economic, cultural, and political terms. Economically, it was the doubly squeezed low-skilled workers who were most concerned. They were squeezed by immigration of low-skilled immigrants, and they were squeezed by delocalization of industrial plants. Politically, it was the reduction of the sovereignty of the nation state and the undermining of democracy as we know it by shifting competencies elsewhere. Culturally, it was a threat to the cohesiveness of national community by immigration and multiculturalism. So you got a heterogeneous set of losers of globalization. You could lose in economic, cultural, and political terms. It was mainly the little educated, the unskilled working class, those left behind. And the focus was on cultural issues: immigration, European integration, Islam. Driven by the radical populist right, the new right. And this new right was reinforcing the importance of cultural issues, which had already been put into evidence by the previous wave, the new left. Now, from the combination of these two waves, you get the long-term trends of party competition in Northwestern Europe. The common denominator is cultural conflicts, cultural liberalism, European integration, immigration. These are the issues at stake in these conflicts. And these new cultural conflicts cut across existing cleavages and transform the content and the meaning of the cultural dimension of the party space, which was religion. Remember, class and religion. There are different names for this new conflict. Kitchell already in the 90s, he talked about authoritarian, libertarian. Lisbeth Hoche and Gary Marx, they talk about Galtan, green alternative libertarian versus traditional authoritarian nationalist. We talked about integration, demarcation, Simon Bongier about universalism, particularism, and Hoche Marx, more recently, they talk about the transnational conflict. The long-term trend was the rise of new types of cultural conflicts and the decline of economic conflicts tied to these two waves of mobilization. Now, there were additional factors. Remember, I had three factors: historical legacies. There was the liberal democratic legacy in Northwestern Europe. There was the authoritarian legacy in Southern Europe. So until the mid-70s, these countries, Italy was the exception, were under authoritarian rule. And the legacy of this authoritarian rule was the total discrediting of the radical right and a low institutionalization of party systems. In Central and Eastern Europe, you had communist rule until the end of the 80s. So you had subsequently the discrediting of the post-communists and the low institutionalization of party systems as well. European integration picked up speed in the 80s and 90s with the Maastricht Treaty in 92. You got constraints imposed on national politics, and you got the representation of national, not group-specific interests, which reinforced the renaissance of nationalism. Now, this is mainly the story of Northwestern Europe. Northwestern Europe is the model case with a rise of new left and new right as a result of the two waves of structural transformation of society. In Southern Europe, and that's why I say what Mario told us was actually a Southern European story. The new left was weak. It was weak because the new social movements were weak, and because it developed in the shadow of the old left. Mario described it very well, the links between the old left unions and left-wing parties and the new social movements. That was much less the case in the northwest of Europe. Then the new right was also weak because it was discredited. And these were emigration countries, so immigration came late to these countries. And there was also a center-periphery cleavage which cut across and which weakened the new right in terms of the same terms as we saw in Northwestern Europe. And finally, the South wanted to get into European Union and benefited originally very much from being a member of the European Union with regional funds and so forth. Weak institutionalization of party systems because these party systems developed very late and did not have roots in society. Similarly, in Central and Eastern Europe, the political and economic transition led to weak structural roots of party systems, high volatility, weak institutionalization, and the dominance of cultural issues for structuration. In terms of economic issues, the parties were pretty much similar, but they distinguished themselves in cultural terms, and I submit to you that there was a rise of defensive nationalism in Central and Eastern Europe. I come back to this. Now enters the Great Recession. The Northwest, all regions were heavily hit, but Northwestern Europe recovered rapidly and didn't have a political crisis. Central and Eastern Europe recovered rapidly, but had a political crisis. And Southern Europe had a double crisis. It stagnated economically, and it had a tremendous political crisis. You see, briefly, you see what happened economically. We built an index of misery, economic misery. On the left you have the levels, on the right you have change, but they show the same picture. The solid line is Northwestern Europe. You see everybody was hit, also Northwestern Europe, but they recovered rapidly. The dashed line is Central and Eastern Europe. You see they recovered also rather rapidly. They were hit the most. And then you see the short dashed line, that is Southern Europe. And it stagnated until the end of 2015. This is the political story. And it's a very simple indicator, satisfaction with democracy at the national level and at the European level. And you see, again, the three regions. Northwestern Europe is basically satisfied with democracy. Southern Europe precipitously became dissatisfied under the impact of the crisis. The vertical line is the intervention of the crisis in fall 2008. And you see satisfaction drops with national democracy and with European democracy. Central and Eastern Europe was always dissatisfied with national democracy, highly satisfied with European democracy. So they were not satisfied at home, but at the European level they were satisfied. Now, this is to show you the impact of the crisis on protest in the three regions. And you see, this time the solid line is Southern Europe. You see the tremendous increase of protest. There was a wave of protest in Southern Europe, whereas in Northwestern Europe and Central and Eastern Europe, the crisis, the economic crisis, hardly had an impact on protest at all. So Southern Europe really experienced a profound economic crisis which was linked to a political crisis which gave rise to an enormous wave of protest. But also notice at the end of the day, 2015, protest has died out in Europe, also in Southern Europe. And that is, I think, where Mario wanted to get at the end, but it's also true for the other parts of Europe. Now, what was the impact of this great recession on the structure of the party systems in the three regions which I sketched before? In Northwestern Europe, the story is a story of continuity. And I have to distinguish between the countries where the new right was already established and the countries where it had not been established. Because if you look more closely at the individual countries, the story gets, of course, much more complicated. But we looked at 7 countries, and 4 of them had already an established right: Austria, Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. And in these countries, the long-term trends were hardly modified at all. So conflicts of the cultural type predominate, and that's new left versus new right. But the paradigmatic case happened in the French elections last year. Who went into the second round? It was Macron against Marine Le Pen. Marine Le Pen, new right. Macron, you might argue, but yeah, I know the people on the left argue, but I say it's new left, and we have to discuss new left. In our analysis, you know where Macron and REM is located in the party space. It's there exactly in the same place as Macron, as Armand, so the Parti Socialiste. It's to the center-left in economic terms, and it's culturally cosmopolitan, open, integrationist. Mélenchon is much more removed from this point because he's anti-European. Now, in the countries where the new right was not yet established, we had 3 of these countries, UK, Germany, and Ireland. The long-term trends caught up. So in the UK, you got the rise of UKIP, and in Germany, you got the rise of the AfD, which in my interpretation is just a belated catching up with what has been going on in the other countries in Northwestern Europe before. Ireland is the odd country out. And it's hard to explain because Ireland was very hard hit by the crisis, but it didn't articulate these long-term trends. It stayed focused on economic issues, no radical right on the rise, a bit of a radical left, but no new left either. The Greens just disappeared because they had the bad luck of being in government when the crisis hit, together with fire and fail. Central and Eastern Europe is a story of consolidation. Of course, against the background of a very high volatility previously, but the bipolar structure that was already there before the crisis hit survived in the crisis. And the focus was still on cultural issues in spite of the economic crisis. An increasing turn to defensive nationalism. Few signs of a new left position, and the center-left was essentially destructed in Hungary and Poland, or it was ethnically specific in the Baltics, because the left in Latvia, the country we looked at, was a Russian party which was opposed with an ethnic left-wing program, was opposed to all the Latvian parties. Or the left in our 4th country, which we looked at, turned nationalistic in Romania. The cosmopolitan position in Central and Eastern Europe is occupied by the liberal right nowadays. But maybe Bela will correct what I sketch very rapidly. Now, Southern Europe is the story of transformation. You have the impact of the double crisis. You mobilize against austerity and in favor of political renewal. And you have the rise of new challenges from the radical left and from the center, but not from the radical right. So it's the radical left which benefits from the crisis in Southern Europe. It's Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, as you know, but it's also Ciudadanos in Spain as a party from the center, and it's Cinque Stelle in Italy, a party which claims to be neither left nor right. And I originally thought you might say that it might be a new left party, but under the impact of much critique from colleagues and reviewers, I reconsider. And it's neither left nor right. Its voters have no political profile. They are indistinct economically and they are indistinct culturally. Their only characteristic, they are politically distrustful and they are highly dissatisfied with the way the Italian democracy works. And the combination of these two issues makes them, I think, the perfect populist case. Now, political renewal is of crucial importance in this part of Europe, and however, there are only weak signs of new left positions. The movements, and this is a bit provocative, and you will certainly take issue with this, the movements turn nationalist to some extent, and the cosmopolitan position is occupied by a liberal right or, let's say, liberal center left. I forgot to add that. So just to show you what, if you look a bit closer, if you zoom in what you see in the different countries, we had 4 countries. In Greece, there is a profound transformation of the left with Syriza replacing PASOK, but eventually a stability of structure. So the question really is whether everything had to change so that everything remained the same. Just you have now Syriza where you had PASOK before. In Portugal, by contrast, you have a relatively stable system. So relatively little change. It's the odd man out in terms of stability, but you have a profound change in government formation because for the first time in Portuguese democracy, you have a left-wing government, which is purely left-wing and not a coalition between the left with some right-wing party. In Spain, things look rather undecided for the moment. You have a center-left with 2 new challengers, Podemos on the left and Ciudadanos on the center-right. You have a center-right and you have a reinvigoration of the center-periphery conflict. So you have the gigantic Catalonia conflict, which overshadows everything, and the outcome of which is undecided or uncertain. And in Italy, you have the rise of the populists, Cinque Stelle and the Lega, and everything is very much in flux. And as Mario says, everything ends up being relatively unstructured. That was it.
Next speaker, Micheletti, the floor is yours.
I'm learning Italian very fast here. Luckily, there's some sort of standardization. I've called my talk Individualized Collective Action, Some Reflections, and I'm trying to move forward here. Not succeeding. Okay, I move this forward then. So you're going to get some cherry picking here in terms of taking good pieces from different types of theoretical scholarship. And this is what I do to make sense of my empirical focus, which will be clear in a bit. So I've been picking cherries from social movement theory. All of you know this theory much better than I do. Also a bit from feminist scholarship, environmental scholarship, governance scholarship. Way back when, we had a wonderful summer school at the European University Institute on Corporatism. It was in the beginning of the 80s. And so there's a lot of ideas from that type of scholarship involved here, as well as on interest groups and political representation. Historical scholarship as well. Maybe not all of this is going to be clear, but you can see how eclectic I am. There's this Swedish word that's gone global, smorgasbord. So that's what I'm doing. I'm taking little pieces of everything and putting it together so I have this nice meal package, theoretical meal package. So there's political science, there's sociology, there's some philosophy involved in this. And I actually am an empirically oriented scholar, so I'm concerned about how political events and developments have been they've also been part of my theorizing. I've been trying to figure out them from a theoretical focus. That'll be a little clearer soon as well. So let's see, now we start. So going back in time a bit, I'm relating to the 60s, and not just 1968, in a little loose fashion. Let's take a look at some things that happened then. And there was basically a citizen's desire for more and different democratic society. That is my general way of defining what the new politics of the 60s was about. And we then were concerned about how we were being represented politically, and also about how political responsibility was being distributed, or who was responsible. In that time. And we could see this quite a lot towards what I'm calling the end of corporatist society. This started to break up in the 70s and 80s, and we could go to Hans Petter's talk to understand what that was all about. So I started to theorize about what I called individualized collective action and responsibility taking, which shows how we moved beyond the 68 social movements. Okay, little bit here. Being politically represented in the 1960s, we talked, was it yesterday, the day before, about the civil rights movement in the United States. They were mobilizing for effective voting rights. They wanted equal representation. So they had the vote, but there was a lot of thresholds in the way of getting the vote. And they needed more. So there was the Voting Rights Act, and there was other things going on as well. Desegregation, you remember that? They targeted the state, but it was not just targeting the state. They were using a lot of legal means. We would call it judicial action today, trying to sue in one way or another using court systems. But something that started up and that really convinced the civil rights movement in the 1950s that there was another tool they could use was the Montgomery bus boycott. They found out that using the boycott weapon could be effective, and that continued, by the way, in the 60s and later on. This was not the first time the boycott weapon was used in the United States, and it was definitely not the first time that Afro-American used it for their cause. 20s, 30s in the United States, they mobilized, don't buy where you can't work. So why, or don't buy where you can't work. Why would you buy from a store, a retail store, that refused to give you a job? So they were mobilizing in that fashion using market-based tools. Later on, they would even march into like soda counters. There's lovely pictures of this. And they would demand to be served, where it was supposed to be whites only. They were not the only ones using this type of tool. At that time, women's movement also did that as well. Of course, they were on the streets. You can see examples here. This is this Freedom March in Washington. And the other one is a women's rights march. I think that's Betty Friedan that's heading the group there. The women's were there. This was also a question of descriptive and substantive representation, respect, and wanting their issues more on the political agenda. They also were not completely happy with how they were being treated by market actors. So there was, at that time it was called the pink dollar. The pink dollar was used in a different way later on, but when banks refused to take them seriously when they wanted a loan, banks would say, "Where's your husband?" or something like that, and so they wanted to be taken seriously as an empowered economic actor. So this is some things about the 60s. And of course, these things are still going on today. This is from 2018, nice protest pictures. And the Women's March was also mentioned a few days ago in Washington early this year. I think a friend of mine I see in this. I have to check to see if that's him or not. And Black Lives Matters, which is an extension or continuation of the civil rights movement. Now, there's another side. This sounds very progressive and very nice. There's another side to this. Ku Klux Klan, remember them? That's a social movement. And they were using quite a lot of mobilizing in the South in the 60s to try to flip the South from being Democratic in orientation, how they were voting, to being more Republican. There's a very nice journal article about this. Now, they're not the only force that turned the South in the United States to voting Republican, but they were, in certain constituencies, extremely important. The Ku Klux Klan, by the way, also used these types of market-based tools. They have their special types of stores where they would buy from each other. They didn't want to buy from Jews, or they were anti-Semitic as well, from immigrants, etc. So you can see how this type of market-based activism becomes more and more in part of the social movement action repertoire. And this is something that I grew up with when I said that political events have inspired my research. I was not all that young, but I was not of political age when this great boycott started up. It was labor rights for immigrant farm workers. Most of them were Latino in origin. And this is their sign here. It was boycotting grapes. It was boycotting other types of fruit. By the way, South African boycott, African, it was a boycott, and also was engaged with fruit and other types of products at the same time. There's unpublished research, and this is really interesting, that shows that archival research going into the archive of this United Farm Workers of America union, and saying that they were really worried that they weren't getting enough support for their boycott, because when they were focusing on these migrant laborers, so they flipped their frame, and they started to focus more on what pesticides on the grapes and other types of vegetables meant. Moms, basically, were bringing these things home and feeding their kids toxins. So these toxins were part of the struggle for the migrant farm laborers, which were treated badly in many, many ways. But when they flipped the frame from them to me, me and my family, they got more traction. Still the same issue, basically wanting the same type of results, unionization, better working conditions. But if you bring in self-interest, that started to work for them. Now that's a question to think about as time goes on. Bringing in some Swedish examples, I moved to Sweden in '75, and that was shortly after. This started up, I think, in the end of the '60s. These wildcat mining strikes at the Swedish. It's a big mining place. It's called LKAB. Multiple grievances. They're the ones that are marching in the snow, right? They were not happy with their working conditions. At the same time, they were not happy with how the union was dealing with their working conditions. So it's like they're complaining about their employer, but they're also complaining about the organization that they have joined to represent them. And this is where we start to see how corporatism, at least if you look at it in terms of you have unified organizations that can negotiate with a unified state. You see that it's starting to fall apart in these years. This is something I wrote my doctoral dissertation on, how blue and white-collar unions in Sweden were targeted from the inside. Now we're looking at more post-materialist type of issues, right? They were mobilizing against union stands for nuclear power and also for wage earner funds. Wage earner funds was an idea about extra profits that employers were making because there was a sort of a solidarity way of distributing wages, which meant that some of the employers had like extra profits, and it was considered to be wrong that it would go back to the capitalists, it should go to society. So it was considered to be a form of socialism in Sweden. And so here you see a little ideas here. Once we see new social movements, can I use the term invading these unions? These old structures, almost like the deep frozen structures. This is part of old social movements. They're being invaded by new social movements. Particularly the white-collar union here, this TCO union, pretty big. And that's this. Also, Sweden had a referendum against nuclear power because the frozen political parties couldn't deal with it, It was on the wrong dimension for them, so they had to turn it over to the people. It was pretty much of a flop, that referendum, in one way or another. This here is a demonstration of capitalists against these wage earner funds. So you find people, I was out there watching these people. They were some of the biggest heads, CEOs of corporations, Swedish corporations, were out on the streets. That's the first time they were out on the streets. And most of the times they didn't even walk in the street. They took taxis all over the place. They were having a great time. And so this was problematic because it didn't really fit either on this left-right scale. Left, you think more working class people are voting for the left. And they're the ones that go out and protest. Now you're seeing there's a lot of representatives of capitalists going out to protest. And particularly for this TCO, it was divided on this issue of wage earner funds. A little bit the difference between public sector unions and private sector unions, but it split up things within that union, and there was more calls for a different type of representative democracy in the union. Okay, you can't look at all this and you're not going to get a really fast course in Swedish, but I started to work on political consumerism using the market as arena for politics. And these things that I've talked about triggered me to do that, but it was a particular result. Let's see if I can get this to work. There it is. We asked a question about boycotting, and this was a study that was done in 1997, and this little marker is not doing what I want. It was also asked in a 1987 study on a big study on power and democracy in Sweden. It was asked again. It was only a boycott question. If you were boycotting to improve societal conditions or to maintain them. And okay, it's not the case that there was a whole lot of people that were doing it. It's about 28%, but the increase from when it was measured the time before in 87 was the largest increase that we seen in this study. And we were scratching our heads and trying to figure out what it was all about. There was good research in Denmark on this issue from the Future Studies Institute, looking at how Danes had participated in this big boycott against Shell because of the Brent Spar. Remember that? And they found a term for it, which we translated into Swedish, and then in English it became political consumerism. So we've seen that people were engaging in this more and more. When the measure was done in 97, we couldn't think of any really good boycott that would be triggering a lot of this. But people were saying that they were doing it. So there wasn't just like one instance of this. Moving on, Environmental organizations get involved in this. Ecological modernization is oftentimes the term used for it. This is the largest Swedish environmental association. It started out with natural conservation, wanting to preserve trees, and then it became into a full-fledged environmental association. It started one of the first eco-labels. That's that thing there. It's called Bra Miljöval, good environmental choice. And this is the way they describe it. It's their own environmental certification system for a range of different products. And consumers can choose the products that are least damaging to the environment. And then they give examples of how it was effective. There's less of these 10 sides or whatever they're called in some of the Swedish laundry products. They threaten boycotts. In some cases, these corporations said it's going to take us years with research and development. They threatened to boycott, and wow, you can do a lot of research and development fast. That's an interesting case, and they said they had to do it because they couldn't wait for the state to do it. This is a state, a strong state, right? It's a state that was known for having a pretty good environmental policy, but they said we can't wait for the state to do it, so we have to step up and take more responsibility. For some in this movement, this was a big surprise that it worked so well. And they started to use it more and more. That union that I mentioned before that was having problems with internal democracy because of nuclear power and the wage earner fund struggles, it started this TCO certified. Turn over your computers. You'll see a little TCO symbol on it. That's it. Why they wanted to do this, a lot of people were having problems with these early electronic equipment. And it didn't really seem that the state or there could be any sort of EU or any type of governmental regulation. So this union decided to step up and put this together. The other one, the Environmental Association, was at a conference in Berlin. And this was being presented, this TCO certified. And one of the key strategists at the Environmental Association at that time went to that meeting. He says, boy, I never saw so many top people from business coming to a meeting. Light goes on in the head. There's something about this that can be important for how we move forward as a social movement. Once again, just to show how it has increased over time, just in terms of looking at survey research, boycotts among the people that are 18 to 29, and then among them they're older, and then looking at boycotting. This is when you start to use those symbols, or use those. Okay, I shouldn't touch that. Use those types of labeling schemes, how they've increased in all age segments, 18 to 79. In case you're wondering, we've done studies about these people that we call political consumers, the ones that boycott and or boycott. And this is not crowding out other types of political engagements. They're super activists compared to people that don't do it. So they're just adding something more onto their action repertoire, and they've got worries about the environment. They can have worries about sweatshop issues, animal rights, these types of things. So it's the Eurocultural dimension there in a lot of ways. So I started to theorize this, and I tried to compare like the old-fashioned collective action unions and others. I called it collectivist collective action, and what was going on what was happening in these unions, and how people were, in a sense, criticizing how these movements were working in terms of internal democracy and how they were pacing their cause in time. Now, some of them had people that wanted to become members, and they would say, I want to be a member because I'm going to work on this issue. And then they were told by these unions, or other types of organizations, Save the Children Foundation, they could say, I'm sorry, we were working on that issue two years ago. So, you should join us anyway, but we're not going to be working on that now. And even this environmental association, they realized that people wanted to, in a sense, break off and create their own clusters within this organization. So they found ways of doing it. If they wanted to work on this issue of polluted water, which was also involved in this type of political consumerism, or if they want to work on deforestation or whatever, let them do it. We don't have to have a sort of a grand narrative, a grand strategy that says this year we're going to work on this issue and next year on another. Let them do it. So loosen up the types of ties that you have and leadership and hierarchy that you have in these organizations. Let them do what they want. Now, that's one of the ways of looking at this individualized collective action. You loosen it up. I've also used theorizing, like Iris Marion Young's theorizing. She looks at how women that didn't have the right to vote in the United States found a collective identity, looking at immigrant women that started to complain about the price of chickens and other things and started to boycott particular stores. It organized up through serial identity. That they would stand outside the stores and complain about an issue, and then they found that they had a grievance that they had together. But it was not that they had gone to a cause to sign up for a grievance, or that there were people trying to organize them around a grievance. It was like a organic growth of a grievance. And they actually had a lot of success. The Communist Party, I'm going back in time now in the United States, 20s, 30s, found this really fascinating, trying to drag them in to the Communist Party, the women. Their husbands are not all that keen on that. They thought they shouldn't be involved in politics. So we see how they can use these type of established homes, these old social movements, as like a point of a departure for a do-it-yourself identity or a new type of looser collective identity. I use the word sub-politics here from Ulrich Beck. When parliamentary targeting doesn't work, you have to find something else. We've also talked about extra-parliamentary in this type of literature, of course. Some of it is, people are really trying to find their way of doing it. So the type of toolbox is really, really open. They can develop themselves. There's no one right way of approaching an issue, a problem. So it could be, you can self-author this, and it can be a type of self-reflexivity involved this as well. And once again, this type of dedication to urgent causes that it seems in a lot of cases that old-fashioned social movements can't mobilize fast enough for. Last slide. So trends beyond 1968. We've left industrial society, working in big factories, that type of society where you have proper working hours, maybe even one of those little punch cards, maybe organized by a union. When your shift ends, another shift may start up, or maybe the lights of the company are turned off. To something that's more post-industrial. There's more maybe white-collar jobs. And I think now there's some sort of market society type of workforce. We've talked about that a bit, but I'm thinking about how the service industry is changing how we identify ourselves as workers. There's more temporary employees, and if you're a service worker, you may not have a lot of contact with your workmates. Maybe you don't even have workmates. And what does that mean in terms of any types of union identity or even a political identity, right? Going to unions has been a great place for certain political parties to try to organize members. In Sweden, at least for the ones that were part of the Trade Union Council for the blue-collar workers, if you were organized into the union, which at times it was like 90% organizational density. It's lower than that now. But if you were organized into a union, you were automatically, collectively, a member of the party. And that had changed because it was considered to be a violation of freedom. Which also explains some of the dips in party membership, at least for that particular party. And then there's a number of other explanations, of course, as well. So there's I gave some examples of how this type of sub-political activity in terms of political consumerism can be democratic, enhancing, and I gave at least one example from the KKK, how it could be democratically threatening. Let's not forget what went on in the 30s, trying to harm Jewish merchants. Don't buy from Jews. In Sweden, there could be posters, don't buy Jewish, buy Swedish. These people were Swedes. Boy, we're making distinctions, huh? And just like participation in general, political movements always can have a type of face that doesn't always promote democratic values. Let's remember that, so let's not glorify everything. So this conference, wonderfully organized, excellent papers and good presentations, at least up to now. It can also be a way of looking at the political condition of today, I think, right? It's not just what's gone on in social movements beyond 68, but we're looking at the political condition today. Because organizing collective identity, causes are a part of understanding the political condition for today. I was discussing on really interesting papers yesterday, and I ended my discussion questions with this question here. If what we're seeing is an emerging way of organizing up civil society, a sort of a figurative moment or whatever of goods and bads, maybe, we're seeing both. Right? Yeah. Or is it some sort of like ostrich moving its head into the sand in our market society, which may also be promoting this Galtan or this cultural dimension. Swedes also prefer to call it the cultural dimension. And if you look at how voters vote, at least the last election, 2014, there's one coming up in the fall. It's a little more scattered. So there was a talk earlier about essentialistic ways of looking at left, right, and this cultural dimension. It's a little more scattered than that. But I'm wondering a bit about where we're heading with all this and where the social movements that we're seeing today are leading us. And that's my talk. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Michelle, Mario, Hans-Peter, for great interventions. It's now time to open the floor for questions. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and state your name at the beginning of your intervention, please. And we'll collect a couple of questions before we go to a round of answers.
Cécile Péchu, I had a question for Mario Diani. I was very interested of what you explained as the new social movements, as a series of movements that are the same because their members are multi-positioned. The members are the same for the different organizations. You show this with network analysis, and we found the same with multiple correspondence analysis, and Julie Pagis found the same on France, and we found the same on Switzerland, this opposition with another method, but the same things. And but we found another axis which opposed the organizations about the links that people have, the different associations they belong to. We found an opposition between organizational and spontaneous groups of activists. On this axis, there are members of organizations which want to seize the state power, and on the other pole, there are groups of activists who want to change the life now. And my question was, do you find this kind of opposition with network analysis too, or just an opposition between classist and new social movements?
there's not immediately any other questions, then let's answer this one.
It's very much an empirical question. I mean, I can say it depends on the context. I mean, I would say, yes, I found it 30 years ago, certainly. There was a contrast within environmental groups, but we also spotted it with other tools in the larger project by Melucci. But anyway, among environmental organizations, there was certainly this basic line of division between attempts to change the effect, or perhaps not to change radically the political system and affect the individual lives and lifestyles and changing the culture. That was certainly one of the underlying lines of opposition, if that is what you were curious about. You are not. Yeah? Absolutely, yeah.
Revolutionary subject, and for the classist organization, it is the working class, which is a revolutionary subject. But it was another axis with organizational and spontaneous.
Yeah, but the other dimension didn't come out in our case, but.
I have a question myself, which I guess ties into all three contributions. Hans-Peter convincingly shows that there is a change in parties, change in voters' preferences, but Mario's intervention teaches us that before we draw the conclusion that these are new cleavages, we need to understand the networks that underlie, that tie these ingredients together. So we would have to do some form of network analysis, assumably before we conclude that there is new cleavages. But my question, based on Michel's talk, would then be, how likely is it that such a network analysis would indeed reveal that there are new cleavages because of the ongoing individualization of our society? And so would, for instance, overlapping memberships in organizations still be a useful condition to measure whether or not we are dealing with new cleavages? And so then that brings me to the question whether we need new criteria for cleavages to measure them, or do we simply let go of that concept and of the idea that there can be new social movements altogether?
Shall I go first? Okay. Well, I mean, the thing, a couple of very general common sense remarks. One, it's taken decades. According to Rocker, it took centuries and centuries. I mean, it took certainly many decades, centuries, to forge for the cleavages that you are talking about, shaping the European political system to form. So. We might even be unlikely to see them at all. I mean, so the answer is there is certainly a phase of individualization which cuts across, which might well undermine or prevent temporarily, at least, the emergence of new cleavages. As it happens, one of the arguments that are made in the literature precisely on populism, regardless of whether we like or not the concept, is precise that populism is inherently, many analysts regard populism as inherently volatile because it provides an answer that can change over time, can change quite quickly depending on the occasion. So what Hans-Peter is suggesting is something deeper than that. But again, as he also said, it changes from, there is variation from country to country. As he said, commenting about Italy is still very much in flux, and we really don't know. I think the important point is to notice about Italy is the fact that there has been a drastic, I would say, at this point, break of the traditional circles in terms of, as I said, of the connection between civil society and mostly center-left organizations. So I think fundamentally the issue is there. And the other general point is that when I speak also on newness and not new or oldness, and when I speak of movement dynamics, I mean I think the most fruitful way is not to ask whether a certain phenomenon is a configuration of an empirical phenomenon is a cleavage or is not, or whether a certain set of actors is a movement or not. I think the most fruitful question is asking, where can we find elements of the network pattern that is analytically, theoretically describe the movements in empirical reality in a specific, for example, in a specific civil society field. Where can we find that? So to what extent where do we find elements of an emerging possible consolidation of a kind of a winners versus losers cleavage, rather than say that is a cleavage or it is not. I think it's too early for that. But we're looking for elements, hints, rather than solid answers.
I mean, I like Mario's answer, but I could add, as he already mentioned, Lipset and Rocken and then Bartolini and Mayer, they distinguish three elements of a cleavage: the structural, the conscious or attitudinal element, and the behavioral element. Now you can measure the cleavage at each level. And in structural terms, for example, I was once studying new social movements in the Netherlands in the 80s. Gigantic peace movement. There was a very strong environmental movement, very strong women's movement. And I studied the structural background of the people who participated in these movements. And I was extremely struck. They were all working in the same areas. They were all in the social services. They were all in the health system. They were all teachers, journalists, artists. So I came up with the idea social cultural professional. And I think you can still say that this type of new middle class people are part of the Greens now. They are voting for the Green Party. They are part of subculture or type of life which is still consistent with what they did when they were in these social movements. There are people who say the new cleavage is actually an educational cleavage. I wouldn't do that, but an element, as Mario says, is certainly that the highly educated are more cosmopolitan, are more open to the outside, and the little educated are those who vote for the radical right and who are those who are more nationalistic, and there are good reasons for this. But education is a structural element. Then an attitudinal element is certainly the attitude with respect to these cultural issues, cultural liberalism, European integration, and immigration. And I don't want to enter into the debate whether these issues are cultural or economic. Take it from me, they have a strong cultural component, and those who are in favor of opening, they are more on the left, and those who are in favor of nationalistic closure are more on the right. And then in terms of vote, of course, we have, I mean, in terms of behavior, we have those who vote for the new left and those who vote for the new right. But also, I mean, sociologists, you talk about networks, but I was at a conference recently where they talked about closure, social closure, and they study endogamy. So they find out that the social cultural professionals, they marry social cultural professionals to an increasing extent. So you have a sort of, I don't know whether you can call it class, because we have the tendency to define class in terms of occupational groups, but you could call it a status group. There are a new status group shaping up in terms of educational background. So I think there is something going on which is measurable. It's elements, as Mario says, and they shape up, forming a coherent whole.
I said that Sweden is moving into an election on the 9th of September. And we're waiting for a really good opinion poll that should be out soon. But the ones that have been out now, they're showing that, well, for one thing, the right and left, it's squeezing in the middle. Anthony Downs, where are you? They're moving that way. But on one issue, they are moving more on this cultural dimension, and that has to do with refugees. Sweden accepted so many refugees, was it 163,000, and many of them have not been processed completely through the system for a number of different reasons. There's issues of segregation, unemployment among some of these groups is pretty high, although unemployment in generally is not high in Sweden. So I'm wondering if this is not one of the new cleavages that we're going to be seeing. And if you go back to this corporatist era, left, right, they found a way of making deals with each other, right? Labor unions, employers unions, the state. Sometimes the state would be the gun behind the door, as Philippe Schmitter used to call it. If you guys don't do it, we're going to do some sort of legislation. But you could make compromises because you can put numbers on things, you know, like higher wages. You can put a number on that, or more teachers or more hospital employees. You can put a number on that. You can make a compromise and maybe say, okay, we'll raise it this much now, and then later on we'll raise it more. How do you make a compromise on this other dimension? Okay, it could be more or less immigration, or more accepting more or less number of refugees, but that's not really satisfying anybody that's concerned about those type of issues. So I'm wondering if that's not going to be one of the big cleavages. And you, in a sense, defined it. You've got, you know, the people with education that are living in more urban areas, and then people with lesser education that are probably living in more rural areas. And in a number of countries, you see that the trust for politics among these two different areas is different. You can see that in Brexit. You see it in good surveys that are done in Sweden as well. Trust for politicians, trust for political institutions, higher in the urban areas where there's more higher educated people, and lower in these urban areas. So we're seeing that type of cleavage too, that is folding into this other one, with city versus countryside, a very traditional old cleavage that is falling together with this cultural dimension. It's interesting, and if you're concerned about democratic progress and how you're going to be able to create strong governments, Sweden is starting to have big headaches with this. It's had in the past pretty strong minority governments that could make decisions across party lines. That's looking more and more difficult these days, particularly coming up in this election. This is what political scientists talk about a lot.
Is this a reaction or a question?
It's just an elaboration. You can abuse my position. Just a second. Linking to Anspeter, I think the difficulty of fitting the networks in the picture, or in the Rock'em picture, is that the networks are at the same time, there is a structural component and a behavioral component. The way the behavior reinforces the structure. But I think it's important to keep in mind that the structural element, broadly conceived, is not necessarily only associated to position, but position creates opportunities. There is a great, fantastic book by Roger Gould, which the title of which, being getting older, I don't remember, but it was published in 1995 on the Paris Commune. And that is a great book because he discussed exactly the common interpretation of the Paris Commune of 1870 as a working class revolt. And it actually shows, as far as I can see very convincingly, that the network processes suggest that there was actually urban residential dynamics, which of course overlap with class. And now if we fast forward to, so the idea was actually, it was the fact that people occupying a certain social position also lived in certain neighborhood, the working class neighborhood, that pushed forward their mobilizing capacity. If we fast forward a lot, and we reach a contemporary Italy, the study by Ilvo Diamanti of the rise of the Northern League, and this showed very clearly that the Northern League in the beginning was successful in the small centers in the northern peripheries where the small industry was prospering and doing very well. And those were all very densely knitted community. Once, it doesn't mean that it has to apply to all over the place, but once you have those networks of activists and you have a driving mass, like the working class activists in the big industrial cities in the beginning of the 20th century, and they then, for a certain amount of time, they provide the force which keeps the organization together more broadly. Sorry for the...
Yes, I think it is important to look at the class basis, but I think that this also requires to go beyond stereotypes. For instance, we worked here on Catalanism, presented as the sort of movement of the bourgeoisie, and if you look at the statistics, this is not at all true. I also think that there is a lot of stereotyping about the idea that it is the working class to be blamed for the right-wing turn, because if we go and look at the statistics which are available about the social basis of the right-wing parties, of the new right, you find very different type of characteristics. Alternative für Deutschland is a party of the rich. So it is a party in which 35% of the voters belong to the highest quintile, and in which there is a very high educational background. If you look at the Tea Party, studied by Skocpol, for instance, it is lower middle class, and it is old people. If you look at the Front National, you see that they have support among the workers, but they have support also among others, and that's one of the issues. If you look what the workers do, is 60% do not vote. So it is not that they are 80% voting for Front National and we can blame them. If you look at Trump, it is financed by the very rich. It is financed by the oligarchy. There is also the issues of the Rust Belt, but it is just one of the type of issues. Trump was voted by the Republican voters, and it was also voted by the rich, and it was also voted by the well-educated. For the Liga, it has been a similar story. So I think that one should be careful in automatically considering that the turn to the right is to be blamed on the working class because they are not cosmopolitan. I think we have to take into account the issues of class, but to look at them in a careful and empirical way.
Do you maybe want to answer the question, and we'll do your
Donatella. I'm, of course, in agreement that we should not use stereotypes. But I use statistics. And I talk about Europe. And I used the ESS number 6, and in a very careful analysis, what comes out is that the class that votes most, in statistical terms, that does not mean that all of them vote for the radical right and no one else votes for the radical right, but relatively frequently, most votes for the radical right is the production workers, and to some extent also the service workers in Oesch's classification, and a little bit also the small business owners. But it is, in a country like Switzerland, the radical right is a working class party, and the Social Democrats are a middle class party. So, I mean, this is just statistical, empirical facts.
But it doesn't tell you that there are also the other classes. So it is not the working class which produces right-wing radicalism. This is
that's the second point I wanted to make. Nobody talks about blame. We analyze what is happening and we try to account for it with theories, theoretical ideas. And I don't think it is a good idea to try to look away and to say the facts are different. I think it's an important idea to acknowledge the facts and then to try to account for them.
So, Manis Weiskircher, I have a broad question, but I'm sure all three panelists have interesting perspectives on it, especially from a Swedish and from an Italian point of view. Hans-Peter described the two waves of mobilization in the last decades, and there was one political player particularly hurt by these two waves, both by the new left and the new right, social democracy. So my question is, what's the future of social democracy? Is there a future of social democracy? Thanks.
No, I'm emailing Nostradamus. I am emailing Nostradamus to see what he thinks.
I can say something. Social democracy in the Scandinavian countries has been extremely strong. It looked for a time that social democracy in Norway was the strongest among the Scandinavian countries, but then it seems more that it was in Sweden. But what's happening now, I mean, the strength of the Social Democratic Party in Sweden has decreased. It used to be in the past, you know, it had actually at one point gotten over 50% of the vote. And then it moved down, and now it looks like it's going to be about 24%, which is really low for them. And the Conservative Party, you know, going back to your frozen system here, looks at it roughly about the same level. And then the pop-up party, the Swedish Democrats, it looks like, at least from the latest poll, and we're waiting for better polling, but it seems to be rather consistent over a number of polls. It maybe get about 20%. Right now it's the third largest party in Parliament, but not at that level. So the Social Democrats, as you know, Social Democrats do, they tend to be very programmatic. They try to find a way to increase their voter base. They've lost a lot because unions are not as strong, maybe also because the type of workplaces we have these days are not, they don't facilitate that type of grand narrative type of political ideology. It's also become, it successfully drew in the middle class into the party through welfare state reforms that really helped the working class, higher education, daycare, things like that. I'm going back in time. But now they're really in a problematic state. They've lost a lot of workers. Some of it went to the Conservative Party at one time, but they've lost workers to the Swedish Democratic Party. But they've been trying to stabilize their base by being harsher or trying to enact harsher laws when it comes to refugees. They've also moved in terms of left-right type of economics more towards the center. But what happens then is they can't keep this, if you call it a grand coalition of different interests, bundled together anymore. So we're seeing tensions between these issues. If they're trying to grab back the working class voters from the right or from the new right, they're starting to alienate their supporters that really care about global solidarity or maybe are more leftish when it comes to economic policy. So they have a lot of difficulty keeping this together. They've created a government in 1914 with the Greens. The Greens are not doing so well either. So they're having difficult keeping together, the people within them that are for the green issues, for global or cosmopolitan solidarity, if we call it that. Maybe they do care about working class issues, but these people that are now becoming more alienated, once the Social Democrats trying to bring back the workers again, they're becoming alienated because of their stances on refugees. And it's difficult to keep this big bundle together. That's the thing. And the party leader is not doing a very good job. So the future for social democracy? Yeah. I don't know.
In terms of the cleavages, if it's correct what I pretend, that this new cleavage or this new type of conflict on the cultural dimension is getting more important. And it is cutting across the old economic left-right conflict. Then, as you describe very vividly in the case of Sweden, the traditional left has an enormous problem because it is traditionally cosmopolitan and economically to the left, whereas part of its former coalition is economically to the left, but culturally very nationalistic or very close. And to, as you vividly describe in the case of Sweden, to bridge this gap is quite a feat. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. I mean, remember Corbyn. He made a surprisingly good show, 40% or something like that. So you can still today bridge the gap if you find, I mean, he shut up about Brexit. That was part of the strategy, if you find the good strategy. And the other answer would be, I mean, it is really depending on a lot of factors. If you look at the Austrian social democracy, it lost, but it didn't lose very much. For a governing party, it did pretty well. Other government parties were much more punished, like the German SPD or the Dutch PvdA. They were much more punished, and I would say they were punished because they were in coalition with a center-right party, and they more or less played the game of the center-right party. They were punished for being subservient to a center-right party. So for a while in Germany, you remember the Schulz effect. It looked as if everything would be different, but then Schulz turned out to be somebody different from what everybody had hoped he would be. Had he been what everybody had hoped for, I think they would have done much, much better. So it depends on a lot of factors. I wouldn't I wouldn't be a prophet of doom yet.
Well, I mean, I just to add on that, it has to be kept in mind that I mean, the traditional large support of social democracy, the part of the support, mind you, working class and also the social cultural professionals. I mean, first of all, especially for the working class, the social democratic welfare systems have worked. They've gone up on the scale. So it means two things. They've been, on the one hand, there's been a cultural change, such that they have started thinking of themselves as a sort of a middle class, and this has corresponded immediately with the threat from below, immigration that Aspetta didn't mention, but I analyzed this very well. And so it's really a threatened body, regarding the social democratic principle. So what is the target? I mean, in many ways we might be seeing, certainly, I mean, if you think of what's going on in Italy, not only in Italy, but also in Poland with the current government, it's not that social policies have disappeared. To the contrary, in many cases, it's just a kind, I would call it, a national social democracy or national socialist. If that doesn't sound too frightening, but so there is a greater restructuring in the area. And if I can just add a comment on the conversation with Donatella. I think one thing is the propensity of different social groups to vote for the Populist Party. And the other one, it is the point precisely that you make now, is the kind of political offer that comes from political actors that, so the right-wing parties may well capture more disproportionate vote from the working class, but this doesn't mean they were created by working class activists. With that in mind, it means that the support was captured by skillful political leaders, and exactly the case of Corbyn you mentioned also proves the point. The point is also the electoral result is a combination of attitudes, but also of the political offer. When a political offer is leftist, it has a certain amount of impact. When social democracy is sort of leftist, it is. The problem now is social democracy across countries as being the gentle, kind, solidaristic part of neoliberal policies, and this has alienated its basis and facilitated the appeal of populist leaders, which are not necessarily working class, but still manage to get a disproportionate support from it.
Yeah. There's other things to consider about social democracy. Electoral scholars talk about issue ownership. You know, which party actually is able to frame what an issue concerns, and that the other parties have to react to that. And that voters also believe that that particular party has the best policy on that particular issue. So what you want, if you're going to have a big social democratic party, it has to own a lot of issues, which is really not the case in Sweden these days, and particularly not when it comes to the issue of refugees and migration, which is the big stickler, you know, this time around. But then there's other aspects here. Social Democratic Party, because of some of the choices it's been making now on a refugee issue, it's demobilizing its associated networks or social movement networks that normally are out mobilizing for it at election time. And that is something we're going to have to see how that plays out. If they're going to continue to be politically depressed after a few of the decisions that were recently made, and they're not going to get out there and try to push people to vote, and also to vote for the Social Democratic Party. There's something else that, you know, we haven't really talked about, but oftentimes people, they decide that they can't find a party that they really want to vote for, but they know definitely what they want to vote against, right? So they make choices in that sense, and that may mean that maybe the Social Democratic Party would be the best bet anyway, particularly if you start to think about the type of governments that might form up if the voting situation is very, very fragmented after the election. So, but that's not really what we mean by social democracy, voting against, right? We would mean that it's an ideology that owns issues and that has a vision of a future. And you can't really see that, at least not in Sweden, and probably in a number of other countries as well.
Okay, I hope the next questions will take us back from party politics to social movement politics, but you're of course free to ask whichever question you want.
No, I just wanted to come back to Donatella's comment because I fully agree with her, and I'm kind of surprised by your answer, Hans-Peter. You can't say I have statistics. What Donatella said was also mobilizing statistics. So problem is that you use ESS data. They are fucking weak. I mean, ESS data are totally weak. Eurobarometer are weak data compared. I mean, they are not that weak, but they are weak. You know it. And if you compare those data with nationally built data, like on France, on elections, or Italy or Spain, you find what Donatella says, which means you can't just say I have statistics and you have like qualitative inquiries. No, we have statistics at a very stratospheric level, and we have statistics at national levels. They don't say the same thing, so you have to dig more, because this is not an answer. And I mean, it's not enough as an answer. You know what I mean? So, I mean, I can show you statistics on France that show that, I mean, the way you place France in one of the cluster, like Western countries, like with Germany, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's closer to Italy, perhaps. So the division, I mean, it's another question. The division you operate between like 3 clusters of countries based on geographical division, I think doesn't work for France. Listening to you, I had the impression that France was like in between, and as you said, you have kind of difficulty to explain what happens now in France, because Macron is not at all someone from the center left, or, I mean, is from the right. I mean, it's totally obvious. So what I'm saying is that it's really a problem of a level of analysis. Comparing countries is fine, but perhaps less countries, and perhaps with multi-level model. Like you have to, I mean, you can do something with 35 countries or 50, but at one point you have to go down and look at each countries and the literature on each countries, and then you find that your result at the comparison level is perhaps not very, let's say, strong. In that case, I think not strong at all.
I must react immediately because the impression is given that the comparative data sets are imprecise and no good, and national data sets are good. But my answer is you find the same results with very different international data sets and with very different national data sets. I have been in a jury in Paris. I think you were there too, Florent Gougou. No? But anyway, he finds exactly the same thing for France based on French data. And for example, in his case, which is data which precedes the coming up of AfD, he compared France and Germany, and he showed at the time that these people, working class people who voted Front National in France, did not vote in Germany. So they abstained in Germany. And you can now show that these people who abstained before, they vote AfD. So the participation rate in Germany has gone up considerably in regional elections where the AfD participated for the first time, and in national elections, because people who have not voted before, who have abstained, are now voting, and they are voting AfD. And the other, where to place France in regional terms is indeed a problem. I mean, for many reasons, you might put France into the southern region, and I mean that's an ambiguous situation of France, and I agree with this, but that has nothing to do with the question of class.
Let's collect the 2 questions at once. So it's Lorenzo and Katka then.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to partially follow Jos' advice, but also to remain in this conversation. because I think that, especially in your presentation, you did something interesting. You put together new social movements and the neoliberal turn of center-left parties. Okay, in the sense that on the one hand, you say the outcome of new social movements is obviously, post-materialism and so on. But then when you put Macron there, when you put other forces there, it's clear that you also interpreted the new left not only as the outcome of new social movements, but as the outcome of abandoning, egalitarian struggles on the economic sides. You're keeping together two different phenomena. I think you're merging together Daniel Cohn-Bendit and Tony Blair, which are two different historical phenomena into some. And I think there is something there, in the sense that this is partially what Nancy Fraser has been saying for some time now on so-called progressive neoliberalism, the alliance between these two forces. On the other hand, there has been probably an alliance between some component of these new forces. I'm not sure it's irreversible, because I think that the British case shows that a man that definitely comes from new social movements and the new left, that Corbyn spent his life in the anti-nuclear movement and so on, has been reinvigorating the old left, and turning back on the neoliberal turn. So I think that you're showing that they went together for something, but I'm not sure that you should be treating them as one single phenomenon, because we're missing something otherwise.
Yeah, going back to the surveys and the election results, I think just to repeat what Mario said, this is the difference between the levels of analysis. And I think this is also something that social movements should particularly look at because we usually separate the levels, stay at our level, and we are not able to, we don't have conceptual tools to move up. So here the problem is, what you show is that this certain group of population is more likely to vote for these ones, and we don't find it in others group of population, and the logical implication is, of course, we find them among the voters of radical right too, right? Otherwise we would find different types of correlations. But here, the answer is even though they are not the majority among those voters, they make the difference, right? They are the margin, and US is the easy example how to understand that. They are winning by margins, right? How much more did they have in votes? How much more votes did Trump have, right? And these critical votes disproportionately came, compared to the elections before, from certain group of population that usually would stay passive, right? So this is this moment of if you want to blame them, or I don't know if we should blame them or not, but this is this moment of the other certain parts of population behave as they usually do. It's like a Republican Party, these people vote for Republicans, but Trump is able to mobilize a certain group of population. That makes a bit difference. And bringing back to protest politics and social movements, I think this is the really important moment where even a small group of people can make a huge difference, right? And really turn the whole politics around. And this is also what we could work on as social movement scholars, because we see that even small numbers that we normally look at with protest, consumer politics, even it comes to electoral politics, even if small amount of some type of population is mobilized, they can, at the aggregate, when multiplied by the numbers of the people, they can really make a huge system level change, right? So maybe we could also think of more some, I don't know, new analytical models, how we can start crossing the levels and connect the processes that we study on our usual level, and how to connect them to the bigger levels and looking at the regime change or the development over time and change of party systems and stuff like that.
Yeah, I would like to react to Lorenzo. I think you make a very important point. Maybe I should not have said new left. That's too vague a term. But the left has different components, and one is the Social Democrats, the other one is the Greens, and the third one is what you could call radical left. In the radical left, you have what in my talk I called the democratic socialists. which are distinguished mainly on the economic axis. They are radical defenders of the traditional classic leftist social justice, social equality program. The Greens are typically distinguished on the cultural dimension. They are the most cosmopolitan, if you want, the most culturally liberal, whereas the radical left very often is not so culturally liberal, and for example, in the case of France, is highly Eurosceptic, whereas the new left or the Greens, they are rather pro-European. Now, where to situate Macron in all of this as an example? He's certainly pro-European. So he's on the cultural axis. He would be way up close to the Greens. On the economic axis, he's certainly not so much to the left. I mean, you say he's to the right. Actually, in our analysis, he's pretty much in the center. But our analysis is based on the debate in the electoral campaign. So this is based on what was said to get elected. Maybe in terms of policies adopted, that would not match what has been said during the electoral campaign, although that remains to be seen. But I would agree with you that we have to be careful with the different components of the left. And the Social Democrats, I agree with you, they can go either in the direction of the radical left or in the direction of the Greens. And they, in many countries, they have typically gone in the direction of the Greens. Now, for example, the Dutch ones have gone in the direction of neoliberalism to an extent that hurt them in the last elections enormously. I mean, they have been a third way, very much third way. So they have been punished because there was a radical left party, and they have been punished because there was also a strong social liberal party and a strong green party. So they have lost threefold to the economic left and to two cultural lefts.
Hans-Peter, you just say that now I understand better, like why I do not agree with where you position your political parties and leaders. You did use the programs during electoral campaigns. So, what the discourses? Yeah, but I mean it's exactly not what you should do. I mean, you have to look at what the government is doing. What Macron is doing now, for example. Imagine in 1995, Jacques Chirac is from the left, sorry, right, coming to the Jacques Chirac from the right, okay, Gaullist party, etc. His campaign, all his discourses, everything that is said by his party is really like a left discourse, okay. So what it just means that what you studied is a product of a competition between different parties at one moment in time who are in interaction to win the elections. It's not at all what they think. It's not at all what they want to do. So at the end, what you're comparing is not what you think you're comparing. I don't know if I'm clear, but it's exactly not that kind of data you should use. You should use what are the laws which are voted, the money which is put in education, I mean, objective indicators, not like discourses in electoral campaigns. Because we all know that what is said in a campaign has nothing to do with what people are or what people want. It's a strategic competition between candidates. And I can give you a very long list, and we all have a very long list of examples where the political parties are saying exactly what they will not do, what they don't want to do, just to win the elections. No?
I mean, if support can come in from an unexpected source, I mean, no, I mean, isn't it aware of the case that what Hans-Peter is trying to chart is the extent to which electoral behavior matches public claims made in a public arena. So the discourse of what matters at the end of the day is people from certain classes, social groups, buy certain types of propaganda arguments, because at the end of the day, the ability of people to evaluate what is effectively spent in education is extremely limited anyway. So what I'm saying, it might take ages before people realize. I mean, as I like to repeat n times, I mean, Italians took 20 years to realize really that Mussolini was talking bullshit, and they needed the Royal Navy coming in front of Genoa, or for example, starting shelling 381 bombs over the city, and at that point any kind of propaganda crashes. But normally speaking, luckily, assessing the effects of policy is a very long process, whereas at the end of the day, what people react to what is said in the campaign up to a certain point. I don't. Maybe this is not the help you needed, but
no, it's good. We have a couple minutes left, so if there is any last questions. Any other questions? Because then we'll take them in this round. So this is your last opportunity. Otherwise, okay, Cesar.
There is an article published in the early 90s by Craig Colquhoun. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing well there. Which is titled something like the old new social movements of the 18th and the 19th century. So he demonstrated that many of the features that we attributed to the so-called new social movements of the 70s actually were very present 2 centuries ago in many social movements across the Western world. So that article was published like 25 years ago, and the title of this panel is, I don't remember the title, it's Beyond New Social Movements. So I was still talking about the same issues that we were, or other people, or maybe you were discussing 25 years ago?
As far as I'm concerned, certainly not. It's a complex story, and I think it originates from the number of undue and unnecessary overlaps of concepts used the same to characterize a phenomenon, and also to take account of the need for a kind of a theoretical change of direction in the field. We were coming when there was a lot of misunderstanding in the beginning between the fact that movements were mobilizing, that identity in general was important for collective action, and the fact that some forms of movements, as for example Melucci was claiming, were directly addressing the definition of, for example, of the self, the definition of the boundary between the individuals and the group, in a way which was distinctive of a new, of a post-industrial economy or different. That kind of argument might have been wrong as well. But certainly, the first part of the argument was that we were coming out from a phase in which many people explained action directly relating to structure. And the meeting that we had in Amsterdam in '86 kicked off the entire conversation in many ways, was precisely from structure to action meant to explore the intermediate levels. And in that context, the role of collective identity was identified. Then there was this totally incorrect association of the role of collective identity as a precondition for action of any kind with the role that conflicts over identity played in specific forms of action that dealt, for example, think of the growing role of new psychiatric, counter-psychiatric movements. Think of the growing role of movements on health issues and dealing with the definition of what is illness or what is normality, and all these type of conflicts, and of course the environment and feminism, etc. So there was the overlap. So I don't think, I think it is fairly accepted right now, I would dare to say, that the attention to Calum was absolutely correct. No collective action occurs without identity. But I think the confusion came from the particular needs of the time to differentiate, to detach ourselves from the deterministic, structuralist interpretation, I think.
Because you referred to this 86 meeting, at that meeting, I remember very well, Sidney Terrell, he said, how do I recognize a collective identity walking down the streets? And I mean, he implicitly, heavily criticized the concept. He couldn't do very much with the concept. But I would like to ask Michelle whether she agrees with what Mario said, that there is always a collective identity involved. Because what you described, this boycott, this market-based kind of protest behavior, it's highly individualistic. And the question is there a collective identity involved here? And if yes, what is it like?
That's a good question. It's not completely individualistic. I mean, there are causes, social movements that mobilize for this. And people can identify themselves as political consumers in one way or another. So there is some sort of identity there. But there's forms of political consumerism where you can really see more of a collective identity when it becomes more of a lifestyle. If you're a vegan, for instance, or that's probably the best, or these people that are downloading consumption, voluntary simplicity. It's called also voluntary poverty by some. You can see more of a type of collective identity there. But if you look at surveys that have been done, we see that many of these people, they tend to vote more like green or left. So there is some sort of cluster there that they're concerned about. Many of them are concerned about global environmental problems or social justice problems. So there is something there. Of course, self-interest can be involved as well, like if you're going to buy organic. But there is some sort of loose collective identity involved with that.
Can I just add? Collective identity is not, by any, as a social process, is not, I think, the identification of a huge, visible collective actor necessarily marching down the streets. This is important. Collective identity is the capacity to link different elements, different types of action, different activities, different sets of people, and recognize them some distinctiveness. Sometimes you are a member of Islamic State, sometimes, or Stalinist party. Sometimes this is encompassing. All aspects, it creates a very neatly, tightly defined entity, but other times is much looser and still enables people to act. Sandro Pizzorno had this wonderful piece when he said, identity is not about identifying things, it's about connectedness, about the capacity to recognize connection. And this applies, we have an identity, this applies to us. Why do we have an identity? Because we are able to establish connection between different aspects of our lives, either temporally or simultaneously, diachronically, and synchronically, and make an interpretation out of it. And we are a collective, we are a movement, we are capable of identifying people who are doing, connecting things, and sometimes things which make sense to us and give us a motivation to act.
All right, with that, we will close this keynote session. So Thank you to the participants. My fellow organizers have given me carte blanche to say some last few words. So I think I speak in their name as well when I say that. As organizers, we're really satisfied with how the conference developed. With the company, I think we've all met wonderful new and old friends. I think there was a great atmosphere, great discussions. I've learned a lot, so I'm really satisfied with that. This, of course, wouldn't have been possible without the help of the people here in SNS. Who've been a great support for this conference. Of course, also the support from ESA and ECPR, all the participants, and in particular those ones who've helped us with chairing panels, discussing panels in particular, which is obviously quite a bit of work. Those people who've been given their time for our keynotes, so a big thanks to all those people. And I think we hope to be able to organize something similar again in the future. But in the meantime, I hope to see many of you again in ESA, ECPR, SNS events that will be happening in the meantime. So thank you. And
as padrona di casa, I just wanted to give back a big thanks to Jost, Kata, and Lorenzo, because I think they have done a great job and they have invested a lot of their time.
You wrote a lot of emails. Yes. We never really made it any formal decision.